Hello everyone, I am here today to talk about the next two chapters of, oops, not the FedEx slip, the body keeps the score. So we're on chapters 11 and 12, or part 4. Part 4 is the imprint of trauma. Chapter 11 is on uncovering secrets, the problem of traumatic memory. I am on my phone again because I'm having some trouble with the Facebook site letting me get on. So I'm going to give a second for you guys to pop on, and I'm going to try to look at comments on my computer. So if you give me a second, I'll do that. And as always, feel free to, hey Elizabeth, comment here in the live stream. And then if you come on to watch later, continue to comment because the comments will be here. So comment section is open. So for those of you joining, hi and welcome. Today I'm going to try to not ramble as much. Hey Diane, and keep it a little shorter. I have a birthday celebration to get started. So all right, so chapter 11, uncovering secrets, the problem of traumatic memory. I'm not going to go into too much detail with the trauma stories because they were traumatic, but the chapter begins by talking about the accusations of sexual abuse against the priest in the Boston Globe. If you remember, I think, what was the name of the movie? Spotlight. I think it's kind of the same story that is telling here. So when it came to light that this particular priest, and I think later many other priests in the church were abusing children, the adults began to come forward. And so it's the case of this man named Julian who came forward, and he did not remember his abuse until there was a trigger. Something happened that suddenly made him remember. And that something that happened was he read about his priest in the paper. Actually, his girlfriend told him, hey, your priest that you talk about, like you really found him to be supportive and really cared about him. He's being accused of sexual abuse of children. And immediately he starts to recall his own abuse, but it doesn't come as a full story, and it doesn't come as even full sequential events that always make sense. Sometimes it's just like a shadow or a silhouette in a doorway and things like that. And slowly he began to uncover more and more, but there were times that he would he went from being a fully functioning person who was excelling in the military. I believe he was in the Air Force, to he had to leave his career in the military. He would have epileptic fits where he would curl up in a ball and shake. And there was an instance of him having like sexual relations with his girlfriend, and something that she said triggered a huge response in him. And so all of this is to say, the author talks about how victims of trauma get flooded by sensations and images, and not necessarily a complete story, and how sometimes it's what they feel and sense that comes to light first. And they may not come to this for a long time, especially, again, if it's something that happened to them as a child. And then he talks about something that he brings up later, which is that Julian, which is a fake name for this person, did testify in court. But because his memories didn't come back immediately, and they weren't necessarily coherent, and they were suppressed, the priest was charged. But the priest's lawyer tried to come back later and say that it was unjust because it didn't make scientific sense that a traumatized person would lose all memory or part of their memories of the event in question. And there were actually a lot of psychologists, I believe, who supported the lawyer in saying this. And so later in these chapters, he gets into that, about the denial of trauma. So we'll talk about that in a bit. He talks a fair amount about war in these chapters. He says that how accurate our memories are of an event, or of any event, largely depends on how personally meaningful it was and how emotional we felt about it at the time. The key factor is our arousal. So he talks about different soldiers recalling their experiences in war. And how their accounts and what they tell many years removed depends on how they felt at the time of the event. So he said that many soldiers, with a passage of time, their retelling of the story won't be as horrified as they tell it. They're able to just tell the story. But those who had been traumatized and developed PTSD, many years later, still told the story in the same way. That traumatic memory was still coming out. Hey, Hillary. Hey, Jane. I saw some haze. So he said that basically, he talks a lot about memory and how, I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but one of the themes in these 2 chapters is that your good memory and your bad memories function a little differently. When you are insulted or injured and something happens to you where your adrenaline and your hormones and all that stuff starts working in a particular way, those memories are ingrained into your mind. Whereas, again, jumping ahead a little bit, if you're remembering a really good day, like the birth of your child or your wedding day or a baptism or something that was just really beautiful and meaningful for you, it doesn't imprint on your mind in the same way. The memories don't always trigger because of smell and sight and different things. Whereas when you, for example, have PTSD from war, and you hear fireworks, it sends all those memories flooding back, and your brain responds in the same way. And the same thing with like rape. He says that there are some people who I'm going to jump ahead, that there was this study of people who came forward who said that they had experienced some significant life trauma and volunteered for this study. When they recounted the good memories in their life, they just kind of told the good memory, but there wasn't they weren't necessarily describing what they smelled. If on their wedding day when they saw the flowers, what did they smell? Does that memory come rushing back? It probably does for some people, but he said for most, those things didn't come rushing back. But then when he asked about things related to their trauma and how it affects them, people were saying, I can't go to parties because the smell of alcohol reminds me of the smell of alcohol and the breath of the person who raped me. And so your system responds differently. He says the more adrenaline that you secrete, the more precise your memory will be, which explains why you can remember, if you remember, if you haven't completely blocked it out, you can remember something traumatic so much more vividly, but you might not remember everything about it. Things come together in pieces. So you may remember that you are repelled by someone who has hurt you, but you don't necessarily remember in order all the pieces of why. You might be repelled at the smell of alcohol and associate it with something that really hurt you, but you don't remember the sequential event that led up to that and was after that kind of thing. So those are some things he talks about. Then he starts to go deep into the history of trauma, and he talks about Freud, Charcot, and I keep wanting to say Janet, but I'm pretty sure it's Jeannet. We're just going to say it's Jeannet because it's French name, Pierre. But they began to study trauma, specifically when they were studying at the time what was called hysteria, which was on page 179, a mental disorder characterized by emotional outbursts, susceptibility to suggestion, and contractions and paralysis of the muscles that could not be explained by simple anatomy. They realized that trauma was at the root of hysteria, and they particularly thought it was related to childhood sexual abuse. Interestingly, there was some backing away from this later on. but that's what they believed. And then he gives a couple of case studies. One that was really interesting was Jeanet's study of Irene. And Irene, her trauma was that as a young woman, not as a child, she was treating her mother who had tuberculosis, but her father was an alcoholic. So she did everything. She worked, she cared for her mother, she supported the family. And then her mom died. When her mother died, her father was passed out drunk on the floor next to them. And apparently for not an insignificant period of time, she kept trying to revive her mother. And then when an aunt arrived, they took care of everything. They got the funeral arrangements done. Irene just wouldn't believe her mother was dead, laughed all the way through the funeral, and then began to, I guess, have hysteria. Like she would do things like she couldn't remember her mother dying, but at night when she would see an empty bed, she'd get up and she would start treating and trying to care for and revive this person that wasn't there. So even though her brain couldn't remember what happened, her body could. And so Jeanne helped her to eventually put those parts together, to help her brain to remember what her body was doing, and eventually get to the point where she could say, I feel sad and I feel abandoned. And Jeanne said that her memory was now complete because her physical actions were met by an appropriate feeling or memory. And he talks about triggers and how this first case with the priest and the, hi, you want to say hi to my friends, and then you probably need to go back out? Say hi.
Breaking my shirt.
Blythe broke your shirt.
Yeah.
It looks like it's intact. No hands. You just watch that whole Daniel Tiger thing about no hands and not hurting each other, okay? Go take some space and be in a different room than your sister, okay? We're having a lot of problems with expressing our feelings with hands, both of them. Okay. So anyway, triggers. So things will trigger a memory, and you can't necessarily control it. For Julian, it was something his girlfriend said, and for Irene, it was a bed. But once those things are triggered, other things eventually are likely to follow. So once that first memory is triggered. Jeanne talks about dissociation. He was the one Jeanne coined it and said that basically, while it's normal to change and distort one's memory, people with PTSD are unable to put the actual event, the source of those memories, behind them. They can't put it behind them. PTSD is dissociation, and the goal of the treatment for PTSD would be association, integrating the cutoff elements of trauma into the ongoing narrative of life so that the brain can recognize. They can have an Elsa moment, right? The past is in the past. So the past was then, but this is now. And then he talks about these previous studies, how these Charcot and Freud and Jeanne believed in the talking cure. They believed that if you could get the person to talk through it, that eventually you could get the memory and everything to kind of line up so that disassociation wasn't happening anymore. They believed that in order to get rid of trauma, hey honey, can you close the door for me? I'll be down in 6 minutes. Close the door. Thank you. So they believed that in order to get rid of a trauma, you had to do something. But they also thought that that action of doing could be replaced by talking. Later on, the author goes on to say that he doesn't believe that that's always the case, even though it's still taught today in graduate psychology courses, the talking cure, that you can leave your trauma behind if you talk about it. He says that's not always true. In chapter 12, I've kind of touched on some of this again already, but it sets up by talking about war and different countries' responses to soldiers coming back from war. And actually their responses were sad and infuriating. So he talks about the British response, the German response, and the American response. And basically all three of those countries just refused in their own ways to acknowledge that soldiers were dealing with trauma. They just wanted to move on. So early on, the British would give one of two diagnoses, and it depended on what doctor you got, but eventually those were taken back and they just were given the diagnosis of not yet diagnosed nervous. Then and they would talk about shell shock, and eventually we weren't allowed to talk about shell shock anymore either. The Germans treated shell shock as a character defect, which they managed with a variety of painful treatments like electroshock. The British began to believe that well-trained troops didn't suffer from shell shock. That if you had shell shock, it was because you were undisciplined or unwilling as a soldier. So really, it was a personal attack. They basically was this idea that if you were a strong person, a strong and disciplined person, that you would not suffer from the effects of war, but if you were weak, you would. And at some point, he throws in the language that this is patriarchal, and I was really proud of him for that because, yeah. And then in America, you know, we always welcome our soldiers back with so much pride and excitement, but we don't follow through with it. We don't take care of our veterans. And so he talks about how in 1924, soldiers were supposed to get $1.25 for every day that they'd served overseas. It was eventually postponed until 1945. And at some point in 1932, actually, the soldiers had gathered to insist that they get their payments. And the U.S. responded by sending tear gas and tanks. So yeah, not such a great treatment. He goes on to say that eventually literature and art was the place where soldiers were recognized and their trauma was recognized. He talks about All Quiet on the Western Front being an example of that book. He talks about the protagonist of the book really capturing what PTSD and trauma is like by saying, I'm aware that I, without realizing it, have lost my feelings. I don't belong here anymore. I live in an alien world. I prefer to be left alone, not disturbed by anybody. They talk too much. I can't relate to them. They're only busy with superficial things. At the end of the chapter, he talks about a woman named Nancy who was also sorting through her trauma, which was very different than trauma of war or sexual abuse. Her trauma, and I have actually heard about this before. Like, I remember having a conversation with someone that this happened to them, and I was mortified. But she actually had undergone surgery to have her tubes tied, I think, and they didn't give her enough anesthesia, and she woke up during the surgery, and she could feel everything, but her muscle relaxers were working such that she couldn't cry or speak to tell them that she could feel everything. And she talks about how this ruined her life. It ruined her marriage. It ruined how she related to other people because she was so traumatized by the memories and by things that reminded her of it. Like, she couldn't be she worked in a hospital, but she couldn't be around people in scrubs because it would make it all come back. But she was excellent at her career. I forget what it was that she did in the hospital that she could be excellent at it, and still not be, around people in scrubs. But she talked about how she was able to do that. And so he says that the interesting thing about trauma is that people can simultaneously have things really buttoned up in the present in some ways, but then when this trauma comes into play, it can start ruining everything. And so kind of this two things can be true. Oh my gosh. Diane says it happened to me when I had my second child. I had to have a C-section, and I could feel them start to cut me, and they had to put me completely under until the spinal worked. At least I could tell them. Oh my gosh. I hope that you've been able to process that. That's really terrible. I was, just as an aside, I was really glad to get to the point in this book at the end of these chapters where he talked about a different kind of trauma. It mortified me to think about surgery, and it made me realize why there are so many people I know who are really afraid of anesthesia and surgery. But I think I needed a break from all of the sexual abuse stories. It was getting to be a lot, and I have a feeling that's not over in this book. But I was glad to hear the author acknowledge that there are other kinds of trauma, not just sexual abuse and war, because I feel like we predominantly talked about that because they're big, right? But there are other really big traumas, and Diane, you said it was scary, but it all worked out. I'm really glad. Oh my goodness. Oh. So he begins to talk about, just like in war, the countries kind of drew back from the soldiers in the same way. Every time historically that trauma begins to be studied and recognized and kind of put forward in the public, something happens where we pull back again. So that was pretty interesting. He talks about when the feminist movement rises, how people started to come forward with their stories of trauma. But then not too long after that, in the 90s, there were these articles about false memory syndrome, in which psychiatric patients supposedly manufactured elaborate false memories of sexual abuse, which they claimed had laid dormant for many years before being recovered. And apparently this is a historical cycle where trauma comes forward, there's research, people start to notice it, and then there's a backtrack, which is really stinks. And he says that court case that we talked about in the beginning with Julian and the priest, when the priest's lawyer came back and tried to declare a mistrial, that's not really the right verbiage there, but the judge didn't, thankfully, the sentence held, but the lawyer tried to fall back on this false memory syndrome thing, and unfortunate. All right. So we talked about the study with the people. Oh no, we didn't talk about the study. Okay. He also talks about a study out of University of Pennsylvania, UPenn, that studied children when they had been brought to an emergency room for sexual abuse as children, then studied them 17 years later to talk about the incidents, and examine their memories and examine, how reliable that they were. And he said that women who were younger at the time of the incident and who were molested by someone they knew were more likely to have forgotten their abuse. And that was interesting. And he said the women who had always remembered their molestation with I lost my train of thought. But anyway, he said that memory, right, again, is affected by your age, and it's affected by your attachment. He said the women who had always remembered their molestation in comparison with those with a prior period of forgetting were younger at the time of their abuse and were less likely to have received support from their mothers. And he said that the recovered memories were approximately as accurate as those who had never been lost. So all that is to say, if you've lost a memory because of trauma, when it does come back, it doesn't mean it's inaccurate just because it was lost for a long time. He says that, in fact, those memories are just as accurate as if you had never lost them in the first place, but the recovery of them might take time, and it might come very piecemeal. He said that one of the reasons that trauma memory and research has had such a problem is there are a lot of people that make the case that trauma needs to be studied in a laboratory to give it to make it hold or stick or what have you. And he said, that's really not fair. Trauma is being studied in many other ways. like in emergency rooms, on psychiatric wards, and on the battlefield. He said that what you observe from those folks can't be replicated in a laboratory. And he said even if you did try to replicate something in a laboratory, he talks about like this being lost in the mall thing, where you can actually kind of get people to recount a memory of something like being lost in the mall, but only the people who are truly traumatized by it, when they recount it, it just comes out differently. You can't force a memory to come out in a lab. He said events that take place in a laboratory cannot be considered equivalent to those under which traumatic memories are created. The terror and helplessness associated with PTSD can't be induced in such a setting. We can study the effects of existing traumas in the lab, as in our script-driven imaging of flashbacks, but the original imprint of trauma cannot be laid down there. So you can't force someone into a traumatic event. He even talks about, there used to be this movie that now cannot be shown, but used to be showed, I think, shown in graduate classes, of people dying like graphically, and then studying the people who watch the movies. And while that's like terrible and they had a reaction, it's not the same thing as having actually experienced that firsthand. So he goes on to talk about the good memory and bad memory study that we talked about earlier. But he said that the difference between how people talk about their positive memories and their traumatic experiences are, one, how the memories are organized, and two, their physical reactions to them, which we touched on a little bit. Basically, traumatic memories are completely disorganized, whereas positive memories, you can usually say, well, I remember when my child was born, I remember having contractions, and then I remember walking to make them move along, and then I remember going to the hospital, and it took them a long time to admit me, and I remember, like throwing up, and I remember all these things, and I can place them sequentially with both my children, whereas a traumatic memory can't really do that. And again, physical reactions, you remember those vivid physical things that made your brain react, which again, when it's traumatic and your hormones secrete and things like that, there's a bigger imprint. So yeah, okay. All right. Traumatic memories are disassociated. The different sensations that enter the brain at the time of the trauma are not properly assembled into a story. And then he goes on to say something that I thought about a little bit, and we wrote a little bit in the comments about the last chapter, which is the importance of listening to people's trauma. He says, in order to understand trauma, we have to overcome our natural reluctance to confront that reality and cultivate the courage to listen to the testimonies of survivors. I really do wonder if a lot of the reason we don't have the research that we need, and we don't have a DCM label per se, is that it takes so much courage, and it's so hard to listen to these stories. And then he talks about, he says, the essence of trauma is that it's overwhelming, unbelievable, and unbearable. Each patient demands that we suspend our sense of what's normal and accept that we're dealing with a dual reality, the reality of a relatively secure and predictable present that lives side by side with the ruinous ever-present past. So those two things are true at the same time. I didn't get into this so much, but eventually he says that, this talking cure just doesn't work for everybody. That's been overturned. We know that it doesn't work for everybody. And then he uses Nancy's case with the surgery and the anesthesia wearing off as an example. As the more she talked about it, it didn't help anything. Like, things got really so much worse with her CBT therapist, the one who just believes in talk therapy and the talking cure. But she says that when she went to a psychodynamic psychiatrist and joined a Pilates class, that's what began to help her. She said as she began to strengthen her psychological, social, and physical self, it created a personal safety and mastery, and it helped her to relegate her memories to the distant past, allowing the present and future to emerge. So very interesting things there. I still talked just about as long, but that's all right. Next week on Tuesday, we're going to talk about 13 and 14. So this takes us into the next part, the paths to recovery, which I'm really grateful to start getting into that, because this was some heavy stuff. I'm really grateful for those of you who continue to share your stories, either here in the comments or privately. You have been bold and brave and courageous, and I hope that I've expressed that adequately. Diane, thank you for sharing your story today. Oh my goodness, I'm glad that you're okay. I'm glad you're okay. And I hope that you all have a gloriously wonderful weekend. My children, my little one said to tell you all it's her daddy's birthday. So happy birthday to her daddy. So we're going to go ice a cake and have some seafood because that's his jam. And that's what we're going to do. And apparently I'm supposed to like brush the hair that I rarely ever wash anymore and take off a t-shirt. My kids want me to dress up. I'm not dressing up. I hope you all have a wonderful day. We'll see you next week on the Hive. Thanks, Diane. Bye, friends.